So my sophomore year in college, I studied abroad in Australia. And at the end of my semester there, my plane ticket had a free stay over in New Zealand before I came back home. And I'm like, well, why not? It's free, right? You got to do it. So by myself, I went and drove around New Zealand in a little rental car for a week. It was amazing. But it didn't start off amazing. My plane landed a little later than I thought, and it was evening. And I got my rental car at the airport, and I took off driving to my hotel slash hostel. That was about an hour and a half away from the airport in Auckland. So by the time I got into the area, it was pretty late. It was dark. It was very, very dark. See, where I was going was in the valley surrounded by 3 different volcanoes. Super beautiful, really picturesque, except I couldn't see any of that. At this point in time, it's foggy, it's dark, there are no streetlights, I can't see anything. And adding to the creepiness of this, I absolutely could not find the hotel that I was going to. I drove up and down this mountain road multiple times. I couldn't find it, and I eventually went all the way back into town to stop at a restaurant to see if I could use their phone, because I also didn't have a cell phone in New Zealand that worked. So I finally got a hold of them. They're like, oh yeah, we didn't think anybody else was coming, so we turned off the lights. So they said they'd turn them back on for me, and so I get there. I feel like this was the beginning of a horror film, right? Like the blonde girl goes and she gets in a car and it's creepy at night and she was never seen again. This is what I feel like I'm in the middle of right now. And so I finally get to the hotel and I go to check in and the owners are on vacation and these people are their cousins that are, running the place for them. So they didn't know everything. And I'm thinking, cousins, likely story. This is act 2 of the horror film. This place looked like the Bates Motel. It did. It looked straight out of a horror movie. And I was like, I found it. The Bates Motel is in New Zealand. It's here. I'm here. I don't have anywhere else to go. And the owners are mysteriously on vacation. I wasn't buying it. I'll just say that. So I got checked in, and I was so terrified. I didn't even go to my room. I slept in my car. Well, slept in my car that night. I woke up about every 30 seconds with a flashlight, just like getting ready to wield it like it was a weapon. The next day, I woke up and you can see all 3 volcanoes. It was beautiful and it was gorgeous, and I had breakfast, and these people were very lovely, and they told me all about their cousins who were on vacation. But I remember being so terrified that night. Just like scared out of my mind and not thinking that I could, what was I supposed to do? I didn't know what to do. This is where I was supposed to stay, so that's where I was going to stay. So scary. And I was so scared that I started to turn to anger, right? Like, I was mad that my cell phone didn't work because it was supposed to. I was mad that I couldn't find a place. I was just mad that it was foggy, that it was dark. I was mad at them for closing up early because this was all their fault. I was just so scared. Earlier this week, I was talking to Marlene about how recently, apparently, I've been very much preaching on like fantasy and a lot of like sci-fi stuff. So to keep that up, we're going to talk Harry Potter this week. Good, glad. One excited person. Okay. In the 3rd Harry Potter book, The Prisoner of Azkaban, we are introduced to a new magical creature called a Boggart. And a Boggart is something that no one knows what it looks like. No one knows what the official shape is of a Boggart because it changes for each person based on what their deepest fear is. It looks different for everybody. And so, they're in school and all the kids line up in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class and they face the Boggart, face their fears one by one. And so for one, it's a giant spider. For another one, it's a giant snake. For another one, it's like a creepy clown one. They're kids. All their fears are really tangible. It's things that they either have seen in life that they're scared of, or maybe that they had seen on TV or in a book. At some point in time, our deepest fears change from these sorts of things to untangible fears. Fears that are a little bit more abstract, like the fear of death, the fear of losing a loved one, the fear of failure, the fear of emptiness, the fear of not knowing what comes next. In our gospel reading for this morning, we see some of Jesus' fears coming out. A little background information to, kind of goes with Jesus' fears. Herod the Great was in power when Jesus was born. He was named the King of the Jews by the Roman Empire, and it was his job to kind of serve over the Jews on behalf of Rome. And he was in charge of Judea, Galilee, Perea, Samaria, and Iturea. And Herod the Great was really fearful of losing that title, losing his crown. He was so fearful. He actually executed 2 of his own children. And at the time of Jesus' birth, you know the story, right? Like he sent out to kill all young males under 2 years or younger around Bethlehem because someone had told him that the King of the Jews was being born there. And so, Mary and Joseph and Jesus flew to Egypt. They fled as refugees for fear of their very lives. So when Herod the Great died, this is when Mary and Joseph and Jesus came back. And they broke up the kingdom into 4 pieces, giving the remaining to his children. Ruling over Judea was Herod Archelaus, who's now called the Ethnarch. He's the ethnic leader of the Jews, but is no longer the king since it has broken up the territory. This is why when Mary and Joseph and Jesus come back, they move to Nazareth in Galilee, which is under the rule of his brother, Herod Antipas. It's George Foreman a little bit. He named most of his children Herod. Herod Antipas was also determined to be the king of the Jews just as much as his brother, and had that same kind of fear built up that his father had. And partially that had to do with no one liked him. And so he was trying to do what he could to grasp to every ounce of power that he could. And he wasn't so much as a great guy either. Let's remember, he just beheaded, John the Baptist. We talked about that a few weeks ago. That same thing, that threat of his power, of that fear. So all of this is going on, right? As Jesus is talking about his pronouncement that he is going to have to go to Jerusalem and he's going to have to die. That's got to be terrifying. Fear. It's something that every human is vulnerable to. It's natural. Even though we often don't promote, we do often promote the overcoming of our fears. Especially in men in most cultures, that it is somehow not manly to be afraid. This is a cultural norm across most cultures in the world. We teach that bravery and courage is somehow the opposite of fear. The thing, though, is that fear is not something that we can control that way. We can't just decide to not be scared. That's not how fear works. There are ways that we can deal with fear, that we can cope with it, but we're human, right? Fear comes regardless of how much that we don't want it to. Often when we experience fear, driven by the fact that it's somehow not okay sometimes to be afraid, this fear manifests itself into other emotions. Anger being one of the biggest ones. Instead of admitting our fears, we lash out in anger to those around us, oftentimes to our loved ones. Like when a child climbs a tree, like way too high, super high, a parent will yell at them, right? They get down, they're being reckless and irresponsible and all those things. Maybe even ground them for that kind of behavior, right? But behind that anger is actually fear. That the parent loves their child so much, they're afraid to lose them. And what the parent is really trying to say is, I am absolutely terrified that something bad is going to happen to you. because I love you. As Christians, we often focus on the divinity of Jesus, the manifestation of God into our world. And what we often forget to recognize is that Jesus was fully human and vulnerable to all these things that humans are vulnerable to. And that includes fear and anger. In Jesus' words to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," what's behind this anger that he's hurling at Peter? The language that Jesus has used towards Peter here is the same language he said directly to Satan in the tempting in the wilderness. This lashing out at Peter and calling him names is a way that he is showing his fear. Because what is Jesus scared of? Dying, perhaps? Failing? I mean, Peter is saying to him, Jesus, you don't have to do this. You don't have to go to Jerusalem and die. We'll take care of it. We'll hide you from him. Jesus has a fear about failing his future, failing his mission. Or maybe in truth, he knows what he needs to do. He's just really scared to do it. We all have fears about the future, fears about what comes next. Because what if something bad happens? What if? So the big question that I have for you this week, you'll also find it on your homework in your bulletin, that nice blue, pink sheet. Yes. I call it homework. Do not turn it in. It's meant for you to take home to reflect some more, to spend some time with the Word. The big question, how do we engage our faith in our fears? See, the thing that I think Jesus needed to hear, and the thing that I think all of us need to hear at some point in time in our lives is this: it's okay to be afraid. Fear is what reminds us that we're human. And maybe courage is not the opposite of fear. That suppressing your fears is not what makes you brave, but rather naming your fears takes a great amount of courage. Naming your fears is what makes you brave. In New Zealand, I was afraid of dying. That was probably a little irrational, but I was. I was afraid of being lost. I was a little afraid of failing because people said, don't go to New Zealand by yourself. And I was determined to do it. If I'm being honest, I was also just afraid of the dark. But mostly, I was afraid of the unknown. This place was unknown to me. And our brains manifest all sorts of things to us when we don't know something. We've never seen it before. We've never heard it before. That's when our fears can get the best of us. Because much of our fears often boil down to that. Afraid of the things that we don't know or don't understand. An unknown place, or the future is the unknown place and time. Sometimes naming our fears can take a while. I don't think I would have been able to name those right away, because I was just so scared and so angry at the time. And Jesus isn't quite there yet this morning in his lashing out at Peter. He hasn't gotten to the place where he can fully name his fears. But he does. Eventually, Jesus goes into a garden to pray, and he lifts his fears up to God and says, Father, take this cup from me. See, fear is natural. Fear is human. And it's our response to fear that makes all the difference. Take courage in your faith and ask yourself that big question. How do we engage our faith and our fears in life? Take courage in your faith. The courage to name your fears and to lift them up to God. Amen.